Duke William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066, and immediately England became divided into a Norman ruling class and a Saxon underclass. The Norman barons were given the lands and the powers of the Saxon thanes killed in the autumn battles, and William gave his half-brother Odo the title of Earl of Kent. Odo was already the Bishop of Bayeux, which explains why the Bayeux tapestry, commissioned by Odo and manufactured entirely in England, ended up in France. Importantly for those days, William applied for and got approval for his conquest of England from the Pope, who saw the Saxon Church, where whole communities still observed the original Celtic practices of worship, as insular, obstinate, and needing to be crushed. The Celtic Church, however, had decided otherwise. New churches began to be built of stone, like this one at Heath in Shropshire, replacing the wooden structures modelled on the old Wattle and Daub church at Glastonbury. I've got the key. We'll go and have a look inside. Attendance at Sunday worship was already a fundamental of the English way of life, and the ordinary Saxon felt that the Norman oppression was a punishment sent from God for their Anglo-Saxon wickednesses, and they simply resolved to become more determined in their daily observances, rather than abandon them in favour of taking instruction from the priests, monks and nuns, some of whose examples they knew, as had King Alfred known, were contrary to the true simplicity of the British Christian principles of the Ten Commandments, an understanding of fairness, and a growing sense of corporate community identity and responsibility. Even after 500 years, there was still a reluctance amongst the towns and villages of Britain to accept the ruling of King Oswy at the Synod of Whitby and espouse the doctrinaire authoritarianism of Roman Christianity. This church was built before the Battle of Hastings and has been in continuous use ever since. Just think how many people have come and stood in these places over those last 1,000 years. In this church that serves a community of a couple of dozen people who built it and maintained it and cared for it during all of that time. The prevailing view amongst those with an understanding of Glastonbury's teachings was that all the people, whether high or low-born, freeman or serf, had no need of any intermediary between them and God to understand the nature of the relationship due to be developed between the Creator and his creatures. Churchmen were there to cure souls, not to dictate or make demands. The man who they had crowned their king, as the head of their royal family, was acknowledged as God's vice-regent for all earthly matters. The Normans regarded the Anglo-Saxons as people to be mercilessly exploited. On his deathbed, William expressed regret at the way he had mistreated to the extent of abusing his Saxon subjects. But despite the problems they endured at the hands of the Normans, many of the old Saxon traditions in matters of both church and state remained untouched. In fact, in spite of his ruthlessness, William showed great respect to all churchmen who were prepared to pay homage to him as their king, something he refused to do at the Vatican when the Pope required him to pay homage. But early in his reign he met his match in a Lombardy monk by the name of Lanfranc, who had objected to William's marriage with his wife Matilda, and who he therefore ordered out of his lands in Normandy. It's said that Lanfranc was on his horse and on his way when William pursued him to ensure he was leaving as directed. The monk's horse was slow, and William got impatient. "Can't you go any faster?" he said. "Give me a better horse and I will," replied the monk. William relented and appointed Lanfranc as his new Archbishop of Canterbury, replacing the Saxon Archbishop Stigand, who had crowned Harold. And Lanfranc, as one of the most eminent and learned churchmen of his day, held the position until his death in May 1089. However, despite his Italian roots, his monastic history and his adherence to Rome, Lanfranc had little effect on the life of the Saxon villager, who had learnt the value and the means of developing a rather more direct relationship with his creator than the Church of Rome was prepared to allow. All the churches in South Shropshire that we've been looking at in this section were built in part or completely in Saxon times. Each one has its own particular character. This one is St. Edith's at Eaton-under-Heywood. And if you think it looks as if it goes uphill, you're absolutely right, it does. Now, returning to the national picture, there was one measure which William allowed the Roman Church, which later English kings realized was inherently unfair, leading to conflict between church and state, and one of the greatest tragedies of English history. The problem stemmed from an important contribution that William the Conqueror made to the English legal system by further developing the courts which Alfred the Great had instituted. But William allowed the English Church to argue that they should have their own ecclesiastical courts. Everyone else was subject to the king's courts, and the penalties in the king's courts were generally far more severe. There were two systems of justice, and the Norman bishops increasingly turned a blind eye to the abuses of the system. In general, however, William established himself as the sole and absolute authority over everything in his new kingdom. And while the bishops continued to collect Peter's pence, and Rome continued to get richer and richer, more worldly and more authoritarian, the people of England continued to pay due allegiance to their earthly and heavenly kings. But unlike the nations comprising the Holy Roman Empire, in Britain, authority in matters of both church and state still resided firmly in the one person who wore the English crown. And that was fine, whilst that person had the strength, the character, and the discerning judgment necessary for such high office. But like the popes in Rome of those days, that wasn't always the case in Britain either. Of course, the Saxon community didn't take the Norman conquest lying down, and perhaps the most famous of the rebellions was led by Hereward the Wake, and the first thing William had to do was to establish his authority, which he did ruthlessly. This is Ely, and behind me is the cathedral. This is where Hereward the Wake made his last stand. In those days, Ely was an island surrounded by marshland, like Athelney in the Somerset Levels, and like the battlefield at Hastings, and it made an ideal hiding place, until in 1071 William finished building the causeway which enabled his army to get through, and the last of the Saxon rebellions was brought to an end. The Normans ruled England for 88 years, a period overshadowed by continuous squabbles between William's sons Robert, William Rufus and the youngest Henry, a series of quarrels which continued into subsequent generations. The autocratic William allowed no opposition whatsoever. The north of England was left totally desolate. Whole villages were burned and the inhabitants put to the sword for no better reason than to deter any expressions of opposition to Norman rule and to destroy the means of subsistence for any future Viking invasions. Once again, as had happened with the Vikings, there were two separate peoples inhabiting England, a Norman ruling class and a Saxon underclass. William gave his lands to his supporters, who then built castles like this one at Ludlow, which as an earthwork was in existence before William the Conqueror, but the stone fortifications were begun during the Norman times. Nevertheless, the existing customs of the Saxons and Danes, already largely integrated under the influence of Alfred the Great and his successors, were largely left untouched by the Normans, whose contribution to the development of British government was more in laying down forms of administration than issuing new legislation. William compiled the Domesday Book, and he planted the New Forest in Hampshire, still in existence today. William's son, William Rufus, was equally cruel, but without his father's fair-mindedness, and his death in 1100 under highly suspicious circumstances while he was hunting was brought about by an arrow shot in the New Forest. That brought his younger brother Henry to the throne, similarly autocratic, but more constructively so. In Henry's reign, the English people in town and countryside banded together in prayer. Monasteries and parish churches were built in their hundreds, which survive to this day. Trade fairs were held in towns, and trade expanded into the Baltic and the Mediterranean as well as Normandy. Jews from Rouen moved to London under the direct control and authority of the king. The Jews were still a despised nation. After all, it was said, they bore the responsibility for the death of Jesus Christ and would never be forgiven for it. So the Jews were given responsibility for everything unclean, especially money, and their understanding of finance and banking was well used, making capital available for building lasting structures. Experimentation with stone became the characteristic of the Norman era, with its trademark exact half-circle Norman arch, the stone replacing the less durable wood, so vulnerable to fire. The exchequer was instituted, an enormous table with squares marked on it, used to count up the taxes collected by the reeves in the king's name, which were recorded on the pipe rolls. In those days, the Roman system of numerals was still in use in Britain. Under the exchequer, the value of the English pound was fixed as the equivalent weight of silver, divided into 240 pieces, each called a penny. In those days, a silver penny. 12 pennies made 1 shilling, although it would be a long time before a shilling coin came into being. It was the Norman kings who laid down the basics of a justice system which built securely on those existing in the Saxon times. The Normans put in place the concept of an objective trial to determine guilt or innocence. The first efforts were distinctly dubious. Guilty until proved innocent. There was trial by battle, by ordeal, by fire, and by water, all relying far too heavily on divine intervention to produce the right result. But this rudimentary system would develop eventually over centuries into a system of common law as a consequence of the demand of the British people for fairness. And it wouldn't be very long before trial by jury, 12 good men and true, would be built into the system to replace direct divine intervention. Henry instituted the exchequer as part of the responsibilities of the Curia Regis, the successor to the Witenagemmo, as an advisory panel for the king. The English civil service was born. But Henry's legacy was dashed on the rocks outside Calais when his only son and heir, Prince William, was drowned in the White Ship disaster. And on Henry's death in 1135, England was plunged into a civil war. Henry's daughter Matilda had married the Holy Roman Emperor at the age of 13 in 1114, and became a widow at the age of 23 when her husband died in 1125. 10 years later, in 1135, she found herself the heir to the English throne. But the English nobility didn't want a queen, and had an alternative in Stephen of Blois, the son of William the Conqueror's daughter Adela. Stephen was offered the crown by the barons, but he showed up the flaw in the Norman baronial system of regal selection. Although generally acknowledged as a fine upstanding nobleman, Stephen was just not a strong enough character to be a king, and many of the barons changed allegiance when they recognised this to then support Matilda, said to have the mind of a man in the body of a woman. Law and order were abandoned. Such were the atrocities wrought during the anarchy of the subsequent Civil War. For well over a decade, it was said in England that Christ and his saints were asleep. The situation was finally resolved when Matilda returned to the continent, leaving an infirm Stephen as king, who agreed in 1153 to relinquish the throne on his death to the 22-year-old Duke of Anjou, a young man who wore broom or plantagenesta in his helmet to distinguish himself and his followers, who became known as the Plantagenets. And thus it was, when Henry Plantagenet claimed the English throne only a year later when Stephen died, the line of King Alfred was once again restored in spirit as well as genealogy to the English throne in 1154. As well as being directly descended from Rollo of Normandy, Henry II was also a direct descendant of Alfred the Great, whose daughter Elfrith had married the Count of Flanders, whose family William the Conqueror had married into. But by the marriage of Henry I to Edith Matilda, Henry of Anjou was also directly related to the male line of the last great Saxon kings. And by the end of his reign, as his legacy, Henry would have begun to blend together the best of the vigour and administrative abilities of the Normans with the search for fair-mindedness of the Saxons.